My next guest has a new book out that is remarkably timely, even though we might all get nuked before people get a chance to read it. I've got Barndon Weichert with me. He is the author of A Disaster of Our Own Making. Barndon, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I am doing great. Thanks for having me.
So lay it out for us. I mean, you and I essentially agree on this topic. And what's interesting is, when your book agent contacted me initially, I said, oh, yeah, this looks like an interesting topic. We certainly agree. And then I went to check you out on X, formerly Twitter, and I realized that we were both following each other. So obviously I agree with your position on this. I do think the war in Ukraine is a disaster of our own making, but it could be a disaster of our unmaking at the rate we're going. Tell us what the book is all about, please.
Yeah. So basically, the book started out as I was trying to understand, like the rest of us, just what was going on. Initially, I assumed in the first few weeks of the war that the narrative was generally correct. The Russians were the big bad villains, and we were living through World War II redux. Of course, I then, because I am a consultant for the Defense Department, I do a lot of work with certain intelligence agencies and whatnot as a consultant. I had a lot of friends who were telling me there's more to this war than meets the eye. The official narrative is obviously not very good. When has it ever been very good? And so I started this, multi-year research endeavor to figure out just what exactly was going on. And the takeaway is the ultimate final product in this book, which is it is a disaster of our own making. We, the United States, and to a larger degree NATO, are the real culprits behind why this war is even happening in the first place. It's been a series of miscalculations and malign moves by what I call the cabal, which is that bipartisan foreign policy elite of neoconservative and neoliberals who've basically run Washington one way or the other since the end of the Cold War. And they have been wedded to this notion that not only can they expand NATO and the EU with wanton abandon, but specifically that they can use Ukraine as a base from where they can launch a covert regime change mission directed against Vladimir Putin, his Russian Federation. And we are now living through the really sad outcome of these terrible policies. And I point out in the book, and I know Tucker Carlson's been talking about this and others, but I really get into the details here with the cabal of how the same, almost in some cases the exact same people who got us into Iraq in 2003 are literally the same people who triggered this conflict over Ukraine with Russia. And so it's sort of, you fail upwards in Washington. And I worked there long enough to know that is the kind of people that get promoted are the failures and the people who do not have our best interests in mind. And now we're looking at what's going on. I believe Donald Trump was elected with a double mandate. One of those reasons he was elected was because he promised to end the war in Ukraine. And now you have his predecessor, Joe Biden, in the last 50 or 60 days, trying to lock the incoming 47th president into a war that neither the president nor the people who voted for the president wanted. And now we're talking even, God help us, about what I call in chapter 17 of the book, one of the last chapters is called NATO's Parthian Shot. And basically, I predicted when I wrote the book that NATO might get desperate when they realized their proxy war was ending badly for them, that they might actually try to trigger a wider war rather than admit that the Ukraine project has failed. And that is what it looks like the New York Times is reporting might be underway, with the Biden administration basically talking about handing over nukes to Ukraine in the final days of its administration.
Are you aware of anything, any more irresponsible ever occurring in history than what Joe Biden is doing right now? Or forgive me, obviously Joe Biden I don't even think he's aware he's handing
not
out soup somewhere. I don't think he knows that's happening. But his administration, I'm saying, this concept of knowing that the incoming administration, as you pointed out, this is now a president that's won the popular vote, the Electoral College, the Senate, the House. Obviously, the people have spoken. We don't want this war. But yet NATO and the powers that really control Joe Biden's presidency, as you said, we're getting it.
Yeah. Yeah. This is their last hurrah. This is, I was told by my friends in DC, what few I still have, I was told that when Joe Biden was elected, the adults were back in the room. Well, this seems like the least adult thing that we could be doing, which is, not even, the Cold Warriors at the height of their power during the Cold War were this crazy about getting into war with Russia. It really begs the question, why is a bunch of red diaper babies like the neocons so jazzed about starting World War III with a non-communist Russia? And the only thing you can conclude is probably because Putin is not communist enough for them. They are very much deeply wedded to this idea of Putin is an anti-democratic individual. Many of them genuinely believe that Putin tried to steal the 2016 election for Trump against Hillary Clinton. And I get into that in the book, that basically the 2016 presidential election became sort of a proxy war in some
Forgive me,
respects.
Brendan, when you say them, let me just take you back for 1 second, because you said something very important. You were joking, but I bet not really. You said when you speak to friends and you don't have many left, because this is, correct me if I'm wrong, an explosive topic. It's strange because if you go back even 5 years and mention Ukraine, I guarantee maybe 90% of people wouldn't even have any idea it was a former Soviet republic.
That's right.
Let alone be able to find it on a map. Now people are fighting for it like it's Texas or something. And so don't you find it strange that when you try to share the facts and evidence that you present in a disaster of our own making to some of these people that you're talking about who maybe used to be your friends, don't they become angry? And how can you explain that?
Well, I was just in Washington, D.C. last week. I still consult with the DOD, and I couldn't believe how many Ukrainian flags were flying in Old Town Alexandria, which is right outside of the city, the capital city. So these people in our government have basically become ensnared by the narrative. And the narrative is, like I said, at the beginning of the war, even I thought that was generally what was going on. I was very wrong, and that's why I spent the last 2 years learning what was really happening. But at the beginning of the war, we all believed that, hey, Ukraine's the good guy, they're the plucky underdogs, and it's this big, bad Russian autocrat that's coming in to basically steal their freedoms and march all the way to Paris. And obviously that's not what's happening here, but they really in DC believe it. And it's sort of, I call it in the book, and this is in honor of Joe Biden and his love of ice cream. It's a self-licking ice cream cone, right? I mean, this is all sort of, this is all sort of a win-win for DC because, and Victoria Nuland, in her retirement speech, she retired about 8 months ago from the State Department. She now has a cushy sinecure over at MSNBC, I think, which is where she belongs. She let out the cat out of the bag. She said, I don't understand these Americans who oppose Ukraine aid because don't they understand that 90% of that money is coming back here to us? Well, she was trying to say it was going to workers in America who work in these arms factories in Pennsylvania, but actually what she really meant, I think, was that it's going back to Washington, D.C. It's going back to the lawyers and the lobbyists and the defense contractors and then all the politicians who get campaign donations from those groups. It's all flooding back to them, and which is why they don't want this gravy train to end. It's why, by the way, Burisma, one of the largest natural gas firms in Ukraine, knowingly put at the time Vice President Joe Biden's idiot son, Hunter Biden, on their board, along with Jay Cofer Black, who was the CIA's counterterrorism center director. He was the guy that after 9/11 promised George W. Bush that we'd get bin Laden and behead him and have flies crossing their eyes. Well, he was wrong in that prediction. for many years. But the point is that this is all self-serving. So the people in DC that I know who still work in the government, who still work in national security, they can't admit that they are wrong, because to admit that they're wrong not only hurts their ego, but it also hurts their bottom line and their careers. So they're all going to continue carrying water for the war, even if it means we go headlong into nuclear conflict.
Well, I agree really with what you're saying in premise, but I would offer one slight modification. It's not even really a disagreement. So you're saying that they believe, the whole Russiagate hoax, that Russia tried to manipulate the election. I wonder if it's that they believe it, or if that they need other people to believe it, because they know that they created it, and it's a cover for what they really want to do, which is basically to destroy Russia as it exists right now, destroy the government, destroy Putin, balkanize the nation, steal the energy and mineral assets. I mean, basically carry out the plan that this neoconservative cabal that you're describing has been laying out and executing since the Project for a New American Century, which started as a think tank, right? All these
John Bolton, Dick Cheney,
Rumsfeld, all those guys, Wolfowitz, all those guys. And they said, we need, to prevent another, now that the Soviet Union has been crushed, we need to prevent another economic or military superpower from rising. So we're going to project American power throughout the world. That's really what they're doing, right? They're just going to destroy Russia and steal all their assets.
Well, and the crazy thing here is, on paper, the idea of we want to prevent another great power from rising to challenge us, on paper, I can't disagree with that. Of course, I don't want to see that happen, but it's the methodology. So their methodology is always military brute force, whereas, and I show this in the book, whereas, ultimately, the ability of Russia to do diplomacy with us was heightened in the 90s, particularly under Boris Yeltsin. And the fact of the matter is that we didn't take advantage of that. We chose instead to execute a silent neoconservative agenda of basically covertly collapsing Russia, the government there, by using things like human rights and democracy promotion as sort of a backdoor way to get our nonprofit, state-backed government groups into Russia to sort of go after Putin and his Siloviki, and to basically do regime change by another name. We could have easily, though, in the 90s, and I articulate this far better in the book than I am now, but basically we had a real opportunity in the 90s to actually allow for Russia to continue existing, and yet to do business with them, and ultimately to turn them into a partner, a real honest-to-God partner. And instead, the neoconservative, neoliberal cabal decided, we don't do diplomacy, we're going to do covert action, and we're going to expand NATO, and we're going to try to deprive Russia of the Sevastopol warm water ports, the Syrian Tartus warm water port, and the warm water ports along the Kaliningrad, along the Baltic Sea. That was the plan, and they were going to use these sort of non-kinetic methods to do it, these covert methods. And you're right, the ultimate end goal, and I talked to people in the U.S. government, one in particular for the National Ground Intelligence Center, who's now retired. He told me there was a group of think tankers from Hudson Institute, which I have a few friends at Hudson, and they're my friends, but the Hudson Institute, has become hijacked by the neoconservatives, and they went apparently to NGIC in probably 2004, 2005. And they basically presented a plan to the Russia team there on how they could non-kinetically collapse Russia within 10 years. And one of the senior analysts at Hudson Institute is very close with Mike Waltz, who is the incoming national security advisor for Donald Trump. This plan has been in the works for many years, and those think tanks are all corporate funded, and it all goes back to the $11 trillion or so in natural resource wealth that exists in Russia. And the assumption has long been to basically collapse the Russian Federation as a single entity, break it into 4 or 5 smaller countries that are weak and at war with one another, and that theoretically our multinational firms could then basically exploit with wanton abandon. Of course, it's not how it will ultimately end up, but there's Bill Barr. That's not how it will ultimately end up, but that is the plan. That's what they want. Just like they kept telling us in Iraq in 2003, the war will pay for itself. Don't worry, we're going to go in there, we're going to exploit the resources, and we'll pay down whatever war debt we incur from it. And of course, what we found was that we couldn't materialize that into anything real, and B, all of the American multinational energy firms wanted nothing to do with Iraq because it was too volatile. So instead, we ended up handing the country over to China, Russia, and Iran on a silver platter. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan with the rare earth minerals. And the same thing, by the way, even if this cabal got what they wanted out of Russia, the same thing would happen where China would basically just come in and gobble up whatever they wanted. So this whole plan is idiotic from beginning to end, but they've been wedded to it for 30 years, and they're not going to let it go now.
Let me ask you this, Brendan, because there's always been this unanswered question. There are certain people in history, I don't know how much you follow the JFK assassination, but let's not even go there. Lee Harvey Oswald was one of the people, but, after his time at Oxford, Bill Clinton spent some time in the Soviet Union, and it's really not, I think, well explained or well understood what he was doing there, exactly how he got there in the 1960s at the height of the Cold War, nor do people really understand how Strobe Talbot, who was Bill Clinton's roommate, translated the memoirs of Khrushchev as a college student. I mean, aren't these incredibly bizarre occurrences? And, when you mentioned Yeltsin, obviously Bill Clinton, we saw him there, laughing it up with Yeltsin, who many people say was a puppet of the United States. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of globalist activity going on here.
Yeah.
And of course, Strobe Talbot, for many years, particularly during the time that the whole Trump-Russia nonsense was going on, Strobe Talbot was the director of the Brookings Institution. He was paid $900,000 a year by this thing, which takes in $500 million nonprofit dollars. It's essentially a shadow State Department.
Yeah, the Brookings Institute and I have a couple of friends over there, but the Brookings Institute is basically an extension of CIA. It is funded by those multinational firms that very badly want into Russia to exploit the resources. It's, again, part of that self-licking ice cream cone. Strobe Talbot plays a small but important role in my book, particularly in the early chapters. I get into basically in 1991, everybody talks about what's derisively known now as the cocktail napkin agreement between Secretary of State James Baker and the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Edward Shevardnadze. It was hatched in 1990 at the Ottawa Open Skies Conference, in which basically the George H.W. Bush administration informally promised Mikhail Gorbachev's people, if you pull the Red Army unilaterally out of Eastern Europe and you allow for Germany to reunify under the West German government, we will not extend NATO an inch eastward. And of course, within months, that promise was broken. But there's another important failed agreement that is conducted in 1994 by Strobe Talbot and Bill Clinton, who was then president, and the leadership of Ukraine and Russia, in which we got Ukraine to abandon their nuclear weapons arsenal, which was the third largest in the world, left behind by the Red Army when they fled Ukraine. We got them to abandon those weapons in exchange for giving them a promise, an actual promise that if the Russians ever came back, we would go to war for them, and NATO would be involved as well. And that is precisely 30 years later what's going on. The Russians, meanwhile, they wanted those nukes out, but they promised if the Ukrainians let the nukes get out of the, mothball the nukes, that the Russians would allow for Ukraine to be independent and sovereign as long as it remained neutral and never went into NATO. All sides agreed to these things. And ultimately, The Americans, they fudged on the debate on the agreement, and then the Ukrainians also welched on the deal. And then the Russians were sitting there going, "Oh, hold on a second. You gave promises." And Strobe Talbot was a key villain, and it was in 1994 those negotiations. That is why the Democratic Party today in the United States is so beholden to Ukraine, because it began in '94 with those anti-nuclear weapons, the Budapest Memorandum, the agreement that ended Ukraine's nuclear weapons program. It all started there, and it translated throughout the Democratic Party elite all the way through to the Biden syndicate. And that is why the Democrats, even more so than the Republicans, are so obsessed with Ukraine, because they've all been getting paid for 30 years to be obsessed with Ukraine.
Well, and of course, you even said it earlier in our conversation here. They're telling us that this is money that's going to weapons contractors, Boeing, Lockheed,
Yep.
and, these various congresspeople and senators have campaign donors and constituents who work for those and have financial interest in those companies. So what do you see happening next here, Brandon? I mean, obviously things are escalating. We've got these hypersonic missiles.
Yeah.
People have said in many ways that changes the face of war, because they are too fast to be intercepted by anti-ballistic missile technology. And the speed is so great that even using conventional weapons, the kinetic energy these things can exert is unbelievable.
Yeah, so I've been covering hypersonic weapons for years, both at my column in the Asia Times and at the National Interest, where I now write. Just a quick thing about the hypersonic weapon. The thing that makes the hypersonic weapon so lethal is actually not the speed, it's actually the maneuverability. They radically and unpredictably maneuver as they approach their target, and that is why modern air defense systems cannot intercept them. Modern air defense systems have a much higher probability of intercepting incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles than they do hypersonic weapons, because of the radical maneuvers that these systems are programmed to make as they approach the target. And so the hypersonic weapons are a game changer. And what's really a game changer is the fact that the U.S. military is far behind in the application side of hypersonic weapons technology. Russia leads us significantly, followed closely by China. We're in a distant third. What's going to happen, I think? Personally, I still think that Putin realizes that all of this is a desperate dying regime in the Joe Biden regime to poke the bear. And so he will probably continue to conduct these sort of dazzling retaliatory strikes against Ukraine, but I do not believe he will escalate into nuclear war. I believe he understands that in 60 days, or whenever January 20th, I think it's 60 days from now, that he will have a willing partner in peace in Donald Trump. So he will basically keep his powder dry until then. And I think if Trump, if he doesn't get killed between now and inauguration, which is always a possibility given what's going on right now behind the scenes, I hope he stays in Mar-a-Lago until inauguration day. Same with JD. Do not be traveling, because there are, anyway. But I think that if Trump is inaugurated, we will have a deal for at least a ceasefire over Ukraine with Russia in the first 100 days. I think we will get a deal by basically accepting or acknowledging the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, which was Obama's mess anyway, so there's no reason to go to war over that. We will allow for the Russians to continue to hold the Donbass without any more problems from us. And we will promise to ensure that the rump Western Ukraine state that will, come out of this war will never be allowed to enter NATO. And actually, under NATO guidelines, technically, Ukraine should never be allowed into NATO, because Ukraine has an active conflict on its territory, which is actually the one thing that would technically prevent a country from joining NATO. But nobody seems to care about that in NATO. So we would have to promise Russia that NATO will not absorb Western Ukraine. And I think all those things will be done by Trump once he has the power to do them. And at that point, I think that all of the tension over Ukraine between us and Russia will evaporate. And I think that Trump will suddenly find less of a headache in the Middle East because Russia will not be so gung ho about supporting Iran. I think Trump will find North Korea amenable to a continuation of the dealings that began under Trump. Right now, the Russians are paying North Korea gobs of money to fight Ukraine for them. If Ukraine war is no longer a factor, then North Korea becomes open to us again. And I think that this budding bromance between Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia will be put on ice because they are not natural allies, Russia and China. They are only being united because of the idiotic Biden policies in Ukraine. And so if the Ukraine war is off the table, suddenly those natural rivalries between the Eurasian superpowers of China and Russia come back to the fore. Doesn't necessarily mean that Russia becomes a special partner of the United States, but it does mean we can at least go back to frenemies, not open enemies. If, however, the Biden administration decides to give nukes of any kind to Ukraine, that would probably lead to an uncontrollable, unpredictable escalation from Russia. They will never be able to allow that to occur. At the very least, if they did not directly retaliate with more of these oceanic hypersonic missiles directed against Europe and maybe even American targets, they certainly would proliferate advanced nuclear and other weapons to their proxies. Iran, North Korea, even Venezuela would receive probably nukes from Russia if we gave nukes to Ukraine. And so I think ultimately the apparatchiks surrounding Biden don't want that to happen. And so I think ultimately they might just say that is a bridge too far. We're going to complicate Trump's life, but we're not going to hand nukes over to Ukraine. That's my hope. Because if they do hand over nukes, all the discussion I just had about the 100-day peace plan, that goes out the window.
Yeah, I mean, that really is the wild card, frankly. We've had Putin on the world stage for 20 years, and he's been pretty clear that he wants Russia to be a modern, fair market economy that can trade and interact with Europe and the United States on the world stage. And listen, I mean, people are like, oh, you're taking Putin's side. I'm just looking at the facts. What you said is correct. He was made certain promises that have been consistently broken for 20 years.
Right.
And we've gotten right up to the edge of the line where he just won't allow us to go forward. I frankly have less confidence that the people in charge on our side will make sensible decisions than I do that he will. I'm a little surprised that Putin has been as reserved as he has been.
Which is why I think that we might be okay, because actually the rationality of Putin in this case, if you can believe it, will save us.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got a hard out, Brandon, and I really appreciate your time. People should check out the book, A Disaster of Our Own Making. Brandon is a really sharp guy who is on top of this, and he's got a lot of experience in D.C. You can follow him on X at @WeTheBrandon. He's making lots of interesting posts. And, of course, people can follow me at JG_CSTT. Don't forget to purchase his book and follow him on X. And you can also sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to odyssey.com/@crowdsourcethetruth, crowdsourcethetruth.substack.com, and subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Thanks for watching, everybody. Brandon, thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great day and have an excellent
You too.
Thanksgiving.
Let's do it again. You too. Happy Thanksgiving. God bless.